Wow, what a way to start a Sunday morning. Good morning. I am Dottie Morris, and I will be your moderator for today. I am pleased to welcome you to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, JerriAnne Boggis. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's musician, Fireside Winds, who provided the music of Scott Joplin, Coleridge Taylor, Francis Price, Art Tatum, and May Dow. I would also like to thank Bell Taste for their generous sponsoring of today's event and Cole's Garden for the beautiful flowers. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought outstanding world-class speakers to the Monadnock region to serve as a catalyst to inform, engage, and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. Today's talk is being recorded and will be available as a podcast and as a video on our website, monadnocklyceum.org. Programs are rebroadcast on WSMN 1509 AM the next day, Monday at 7 a.m., and on WUML 91.5 FM the following Wednesday at 11 o'clock. Following the presentation, our speaker will answer questions from the audience. Those present in the church, you may submit your questions via these cards. They should be on the racks there in front of you. And someone will pick them up from you, and so they will give them to me. So I will be able to ask the questions. For those watching virtually, please submit your questions using the live chat section on YouTube. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported entirely through donations and contributions from our audience and community members. We deeply appreciate your donations, which you may place in the glass bowls in the church and in the parish hall. Those listening at home, you may make your contributions on our website or by mail. Thank you for your generous support. We encourage you to give feedback on today's program using the green cards in the pew. I gave you the wrong cards. Yellow cards, questions, green cards, pew, to give feedback. It's very important to do that. And those of you who are listening at home may do so by using the live online. After the program, we invite you to attend an informal reception in the parish hall through the doors to my right, okay? So our speaker today is JerriAnne Boggis. In your program, you have a description of all the things she has done, and so no need of me rereading those things, but I would like to add a couple things that I think are very important for us to know today. Ms. Boggis is an amazing person with a clear vision. She has a love for all people with a particular love for Black folks. She understands the complexities involved in how race has played a major role in how stories are told, who tells them, when they are told, and what is told. Her storytelling ability allows the listener to engage with the story with a deep desire to learn more. The reconnection with the past that she presents is an opportunity to engage in a different part of all of ourselves. She knows that these stories and the people are regardless of race, it pertains to all of us. She knows that we are interconnected in this beautiful tapestry of what we call life. Her work at the Black Heritage Trail has allowed us to have difficult conversations about the past to understand how this past continues to influence the current situation we're living in as we forge towards a more peaceful and connected, inclusive, and equitable future. Her work, with that of Mrs. Valerie Cunningham, has allowed for the voice of the unheard and forgotten Black people from the past to rise up and be heard, and most of all, remembered. This work has served to shatter the myth that the existence of Black people in New Hampshire is a new thing. As she speaks, she is speaking with the ancestors and the future generations in mind. I am sure the ancestors are smiling with pride about the work she is doing. So as you listen, allow yourself to be moved by her words. So, JerriAnne Boggis, please.
So thank you, Dottie, and thanks for putting me on notice. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I want to thank, before I start, Jane Eckert and Meredith Martin, who brought my name to the Lyceum Committee after they went on a tour that we did in Manchester. Hey. So now I'm getting nervous. They're people I know. But before I start today, I think I'll start with a tale, a Nigerian tale. And this is a story about a father and his son. Each night when the father they're going to bed, their nightly routine is the father, will tell him the story about the lion, right? And he said, we know the lion is the king of the jungle, and each story has the man winning over the lion. All the stories end with the lion dying. And one night the son said to the father, "Dad, if the lion is king of the jungle, how come he always lose?" And the father said, "The lion will win when he writes the story." So that's the work that we're doing here, that I'm doing at the trail, reintroducing stories that had been erased from New Hampshire's history. And not only erased from New Hampshire's history, but America's history, because we're just a microcosm of the whole country. This willful, deliberate kind of erasure of these stories. There was a time when some of the people that I'll mention to you today, they were written in our stories. Now, New Hampshire, as we know, is often described as one of the whitest states in the Union. And that just erases over 400 years of Black history in our state, and stories that really, once known, would totally change our perception and perspective of our state, giving it more color and more inclusiveness. By fostering these dialogues, by including these stories, it is our hope that we can have more honest dialogue, that dialogue that our country really needs to do, to have that dialogue about race, so we can erase the anxieties that we have about talking about race. Now, as I said before, that in our early histories, the Black histories, we knew of some of the folks. It was written in them. For example, in Milford, the early history of Milford, the Ramsdale history, there was a man, Mr. Blanchard, who was written in, and he came to Milford in 1804, and it was written that he was a businessman and the town veterinarian. However, 78 years later, when, with the right publication of the book, it was written, there were no veterinarians in the town of Milford until 1899, totally erasing his presence. And we see that even a more grievous case. Have anybody heard of the story of Malaga Island? So Malaga Island is one of the islands in Cosco Bay, Maine. And it was an island that was filled with African Americans, Black folks, poor white folks, Native Americans. And the state decided that it was a blight on its tourist industry. It was not a good look. So they totally moved everybody off of the island, including they dug up the graves, erasing them totally from being there on the island, and moved them to the house of the feeble-minded. So we have these histories of willful and deliberate erasure. Now, another quick story I wanted to share. I may be talking in circles, but I think circles bring us back to the center. I know Dottie can understand this because we had a talk about our trips to Africa. I just came back 2 weeks ago from Tanzania. And I think the biggest impression that that happened for me was not on the safaris, the many safaris I went on, but when we went to the one of the gorges that it's said to be the birthplace of man, where they found the earliest skeletal remains of a Homo sapien. And it dawned on me that if you had that in your backyard, that history, that cellular memory, that DNA, how could you walk bent? Right? You have to walk upright. You have to carry that knowledge. And it makes me wonder how that whole European notion of a race being superior and another inferior came about when we know and we have this knowledge of the birthplace of man. So that's the work that we're doing here in New Hampshire with the Black Heritage Trail. It's reintroducing these stories so that we can get a better understanding of our history and each other, that humanness that connects us all. You might have gotten a copy of a 1779 petition. One of the earliest documents that we have here in New Hampshire that talks about the presence of enslaved Africans here in Portsmouth. So that 1779 petition was written by 20 men who said that they were from Africa, born and raised in Africa, kidnapped and brought here, and they were arguing just like our forefathers, the American forefathers were at the time, for their freedom. And that document, once you read it, dispels and totally erases any of those negative stereotypes that we have of what it means to be Black. It is one of the most, I think I forgot to bring it. It rivals the American petition to the British for freedom. And so often we're told that when we look at the early histories of Blacks, African Americans, Africans in the country, we're told that they're illiterate, they can't read, they don't have that sense of argument. And this document totally belies that. In fact, it's been studied today for a line that is mentioned in it, the conscious of the equal dignity of human nature. That phrase, the dignity of human nature, it's the first time that a scholar who is researching this paper now have seen that in this hemisphere. And that means the men that wrote this brought that sensibility, that African sensibility, the dignity of human nature with them. So we hope to return that dignity to Black folks as we tell their story here. I don't know if any of you been to Portsmouth to see the African burying ground. If you have seen that, yeah. And once seeing that, it tells a whole different story of our state, right? For so often, I don't want to say we pretend, but we have this notion that there are no Black folks here. But that burial ground tells us that we were totally involved in the slave trade. Portsmouth, next to Newport, Rhode Island, was the largest importers of kidnapped Africans. On the dock, our only dock, we sold Africans into slavery, we enslaved them, and moved them from our state to other states. Again, our no-tax state, property was not taxed, and people were treated as property. So we see from then, with that burial site, that had been totally erased, buried over, built upon, a sacred space defiled, that story of enslavement was erased. It didn't fit into our sensibilities, that northern sensibilities of the abolitionist state, right? So they had to erase it. And New Hampshire is, we really love the stories too of being first, right? The first in the nation to vote, the first in the nation to do things. We also have a lot of firsts when it comes to Black history. And these are firsts that we really should hold up and honor, and everyone should know these stories. It should be part of our myth, that same sensibilities that tells us that we should individually pull ourselves up by a bootstrap. There were people here who, with a lot less than we have, were doing just that. And that brings to mind the story of Wentworth Cheswell, who was the first Black person in the country to be elected to public office. Now, he is the son of a formerly enslaved man, and he ends up being the first known African to be elected to public office. He served in every conceivable position in the town. He was the town constable, the assessor, the selectman, the coroner, the justice of the peace, and he was also the town historian. And one of the little anecdotes for Wentworth Cheswell is that he, like Paul Revere, had a midnight ride from Portsmouth to Exeter, warning that the British were coming. Now, Paul Revere lives on, revered in our mythology, in our stories, but not so much Wentworth Cheswell. He's very known. But some folks he's from Newmarket, are working to make sure that he is no longer erased. They're working to build a monument in his name, and there's a movement in the State House to get a portrait of him in the State Hall. However, that's a little bit difficult because there are no pictures of him anywhere. making it difficult to do a portrait. And there was a discussion about whether they should make an image of Wentworth Cheswell up. And a lot of us objected to that as well, even though we did that to Harriet Wilson in Milford, New Hampshire. Another first, Harriet Wilson is the first Black woman to publish a novel in English in the world, and she was born and raised in Milford, New Hampshire. She wrote a book, Our Nig, or Sketches in the Life of a Free Black. And that wasn't just the whole part of her title. She wanted everybody to know what she was writing about. The full title is, and I'll say it again, Our Nig, or Sketches in the Life of a Free Black, in a 2-story white house north, showing that slavery shadows falls even there. So she really wanted us to know that story of enslavement here in the North. Not that we were just an abolitionist state, but we were also a pro-slavery state as well. Now, Wilson was not only an author, but she was an entrepreneur. She created these hair dyes that she would sell from door to door along with her book back in 1859. We know she had a big blooming business because in 1860, just before her son dies, there was an ad in a Philadelphia paper for 1,200 bottles of Mrs. Wilson's hair rejuvenating liquid. So, turns gray hair black. Yeah. And we also knew she had a school in Boston later on in her life. She was a famed spiritualist and really a woman that invented and reinvented herself at every moment in her life, not only for her survival, but also for being human, telling her story. Another first that we have for New Hampshire's Black history, and we could go on for a lot of these, but that's Richard Potter. Anybody here knows of Potter's Place in Andover? Yeah. So Potter's Place was named after Richard Potter. He is what we would consider today the first celebrity of any color, black or white. He was a magician, a ventriloquist, and he traveled all across Canada and the US territories at that time, performing his acts. He was well known. He moved to Andover, built his house, and they say, mythology, can't prove that his house was the model for our state capitol house right now. Near Andover is another place that I just want to mention is Coit Mountain. Anybody hiked Coit Mountain? Knows the story? Coit Mountain is named after Vance Coit, a Revolutionary War vet who lived at the base of Coit Mountain. It's in Newport, New Hampshire. There was a colony of, they called them a colony of African Americans that lived there, maybe 7 or 8 families who were also Revolutionary War vets. But what I find really interesting about the story here, we have the naming of a place. We have a group of people that are contributing to the well-being of the town. And I don't know if you remember 4 years ago, there was this near lynching in Claremont, which is 7 miles away from Coit Mountain. A young 9-year-old boy and another group of young boys around the same age almost lynched this young boy of color. And these, to me, if these stories were part of the stories that we tell, the narratives that we know, not forgotten, not erased, but an integral part of our stories, would that lynching, near lynching, have happened? I don't think so. I think if we know these stories and honor these stories, we would have a much better understanding of each other. There's also the story there are 2 more stories I'll tell that I think really puts New Hampshire on the map and really, once known, changes our own perception of what it means to be human. And that is the story of Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire. Does anybody knows the story of Noyes Academy? Okay. So Noyes Academy, in 1835, a group of New Hampshire abolitionists opened Noyes Academy, and it became the first racially integrated educational school, and not only by race but by gender. There were a few schools that were integrated by race at the same time as Noyes Academy, but Noyes Academy was the first one that also had male and female students. And the African Americans who came there, of course it's time of racism, traveled from New York, from Philadelphia, from all over to come to this little place in Canaan, New Hampshire, for a better education. Unfortunately, Noyes Academy didn't last very long. It only lasted for 6 months. The very thing that made it the first is the very thing that destroyed the school, the fear of the amalgamation of the blood. There was so much, because it was a co-educational institution, the fear that we would deplete the white blood caused the towns, the surrounding towns, some in Canaan, and people from all these surrounding towns to gather their oxen, over 90 oxen, take them out of the fields, bring them to Canaan, rope the building, pull it off its foundation, took it to the swamp, burnt it, and ended that brief history, that brief experiment that was Noyes Academy. However, there were 2 really famous abolitionists that came out of that school. And it was Alexander Crummell and Henry Highland Garnett. Their history and their time as abolitionists is really well written and well documented over. But Garnett would become the first person to address Congress, and Crummell, he graduated from the University of Cambridge and also started the AME Church. So along with a lot of stuff that they did, we'll claim them. New Hampshire will claim them. I will. The other story that puts us on the national stage, way beyond just our shores of New Hampshire, is that of Ona Marie Judge. And Ona Marie Judge was enslaved to George and Martha Washington. Yes, our presidents did own slaves. Now, Ona, she escapes from the presidential mansion, which was in Philadelphia at the time, She ends up coming to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she tries to make a living for herself. And the story that puts us on the national map is two things that the Washingtons did. First, Philadelphia was a gradual abolitionist state. And what that meant is that an enslaved person, after living there for 6 months, could file a petition for their freedom. And what the Washingtons did to get around that law was that every 6 months, they would turn over their staff, their slaves, their enslaved people. They would either take them back to Mount Vernon or take them to adjoining states that didn't have that gradual emancipation, gradual abolitionist law. So it was on one of those 6 months when the servants were being turned over, that Harriet just walks out. And she goes to the Black community for the Underground Railroad and ends up on a ship that brings her to Portsmouth. We know a lot about her because she tells her story to 2 newspapers later on in life. And George Washington also, he puts an ad out in the paper for her to be returned, even though he, on one hand, was saying that he believed in emancipation. On the other hand, he was sending slave catchers to capture her, to bring her back to his fold under his mastery. Now, when Ona dies, before she dies, in that interview that she had, she was asked why she left, why she didn't go back. And, she was living in poverty, that, she'd left the house of the president, this mansion, and this well-living. She said she'd much rather die free than live in that luxury. Now, why are some of these stories important? For me, it creates a whole different image of what it means to live in New Hampshire. Once you have these stories, once they're visible, once they're being told, for a person like me, a person of color coming into a place where the majority of the people look like you, it creates that sense of belonging. It creates that connection to a past, a story that tells me that we have been here before and we continue to be here. And once we create that sense, once we have that sense of belonging, once we're connected to a place, you're involved in that place. I know before I did the work on the Harriet Wilson project to build that monument for her in Milford, I was never involved in the town. I was involved with my kids' life and mine, and getting them to soccer, getting them home. But once I started doing that work, I was totally involved in what the town was doing, who was doing what, who were the selectmen, what were the policies, how do we move, and really engage. And I think that's one of the things when we look at our state, a bigger picture of our state. Our state is aging, our young folks are leaving, and whether we want to admit it or not, our country is browning. And if we don't do things to encourage people to move to our state, if we're not a welcoming state, if we're not an evolved group, we stand to lose any economic advantage we may have, but also our quality of life will change. Today, the trail, we're really involved in making this history visible. We're putting markers up across the state for other histories. Recently, we unveiled a marker in Nashua that takes us a little bit out of the 18th century into a more 20th century story, but we put a marker up for Newcomb and Campanella, the two baseball players that integrated baseball, and that happened in Nashua, New Hampshire, before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. So again, for sports fan, that was a big movement for New Hampshire, a big historical movement. We also did a marker up in Kittery, Maine, for a place called Rock Rest, which was a guest house for Black travelers during the time of de facto segregation, where hotels would not admit people of color in. So Rock Rest is one of our national treasures that survived part of the Green Book and was a home for travelers. So our history spans not only from the early 1700s. Believe it or not, there were Black folks in New Hampshire before the time of slavery, when they traded with Native Americans here way before enslavement, and we've been here all along, being an integral part of New Hampshire's history. And I think once we introduce these narratives, if we start to think about changing the stories that we tell, so often, America's narrative is one-sided, one dimension, one color, and these stories, not only Native Americans, African American stories, Black stories, gives us a more honest view of who we are as a country, as citizens in this country, and as people, as human beings that are just trying to do human stuff, being part of this world and doing on our journey towards being a more equal and just society. And that's just an overview. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, JerriAnne, for your insights on remembering New Hampshire's Black past. So we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience. But, I'll start off if that's okay. Well, as if you're going to say no, I just realized that. I'm asking for permission. I wonder. Pardon me?
Do I have to stand up here or can I come down there now? This is just odd.
You can do whatever. I feel happy looking up to you since you're, okay. Since you're like my shero, as Janetta Cole said. But I wonder, if you have a narrative that goes on for so many years, like for hundreds of years, and now some of the work that the Black Heritage Trail is doing is kind of debunking some of that information. Have you or the trail received any resistance as a result of unearthing some things that I think most people wish not to unearth, because it really creates a debunking of the way you have to think about who you are and what you stand for. And so, and all of the stories build on each other, so you could imagine how that shakes things up. Have you been met with any resistance?
I can honestly say no.
Oh, good.
Not that I know of, but the people that we talk to are people like you You're here because you're interested, right? You want to know more. I don't imagine the people that really find it difficult to talk about race or don't believe any of these stories. I don't think a Proud Boy would be in the audience, you know? So I think people are, especially since the murder of George Floyd, people are looking for the truth, right? How did we get here? What brought us here, right? And there is that need and that search for it. There's one story that sometimes when we have these tours, that people are always shocked at. So the first known enslaved person that we have on record was in 1649. And there was a case, we know the story because there was a case brought against the enslaver, right? The man was captured on the west coast of Africa and brought to Portsmouth would have been the Massachusetts at that time, right? So he was brought to Massachusetts through Portsmouth, and the case was heard in the Portsmouth court. But the case wasn't because the enslaver captured this man from Africa and brought him illegally to the country, right? The case was because he was captured on a Sunday, and it's the Sabbath, right? So you can't work on the Sabbath. So the enslaver lost the case. The man was supposed to have been returned to his home. We don't know if he ever was. But when we tell that story, we get that same reaction. That just can't be true, right? Everybody thinks that it was because he was captive, he was enslaved. But no. Yeah.
One more question. I appreciated you starting the story about your trip to Tanzania. And I appreciate how I think you were trying to invoke the audience to realize how interconnected we all are. That the stories that you are telling, the stories that the Black Heritage Trail is telling, is not just about Black folks, it's about all of us because we're all interconnected. So I could really appreciate it. The second thing is that at the point that I felt like you drove home by telling that story about Tanzania, is that people of African descent, our stories did not start with the enslavement story. That we had stories long before that. So I could appreciate that you brought all of that into being as we talk about New Hampshire. So I don't know if that's what you were trying to, that's what your plan was?
I hope I did.
That's what you did. That's what you did in my
I hope
heart.
I did. It's definitely one of those things that we look at. We have to move beyond this, and I don't want to say colorblind society, but we do have to move beyond this binaries of blackness and whiteness. If we stand, if we have any hope of being good humans that we thrive to be, we have to move beyond that. And I think understanding, that's why that movement, that being at that place in Tanzania was so impactful for me, because it was connecting with a history on a cellular level. You know, intellectually, we can understand certain things. We can understand a lot of things when we read. We can be at a lot of places through our imagination when we read. But being at a place and knowing the history changes it, and it changes us, changes all of us to know this history.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a stack of questions. So But I want to start with a comment that someone made rather than a question. And they start off by saying, "This is not a question. It is a sincere apology. You named so many people and so many places inhabited by Blacks. I truly regret that this information has been brought to my attention in the 57 years I've lived in New Hampshire. Thank you so much for your thoughtful bringing this to my attention."
Thank you. Thank you. Now, if we could only get it in our schools, right?
Yeah, so when you are giving this presentation 50 years from now, no one has to write a card
exactly.
like this. Is there a book you would recommend that would tell the story of the great Blacks in New Hampshire that has been erased? I'm sorry, sometimes I can't understand handwriting.
So Valerie Cunningham wrote a book, it's Blacks in Portsmouth. Is that what it's called? Valerie's book?
Yeah, I think it's called Black Portsmouth.
Black Portsmouth, yeah. And if you go on our website, we did a project with the Episcopal Church for two years in a row during their Easter for Lenten season, and part of that congregation, they wanted to understand a story, a Black story, and then, for Lent, do a prayer and so on. So for 40 days during Lent, we had 40 stories, and we did that 2 years in a row. So there are 80 stories of New Hampshire's Black history on our website, blackheritagetrailnh.org, under New Hampshire history. And those 80 stories are there. We have one of the collections we have at our office called How the Light Gets In, that has 40 of the stories. And there are lots of other books around that people are starting to look at, but no definitive one on New Hampshire's Black history yet. We're working on it.
Of the many stories out there, what are the most eager to unearth and discover? So I guess there are many stories, but what other ones are out there that are just like begging to be told? I'm assuming, so I'm taking some interpretation here that might not be right. Or what is the most important for us to unearth? What are some stories that you feel like are the most important for us to unearth?
Now, I look at a lot of these stories as being important. And if I think about the story of the African burying ground in Portsmouth, its erasure and the effort of the town to bring it back to the public and to create that sacred space, that's an important story to me, because it is a visual representation of what we've done to Black history, right? Totally erasing it, totally disregarding. And we haven't only done it to Black history, we've done it to Native American history as well, right? Just the totally clean slate where it just doesn't exist. A lot of towns right now are celebrating the 400th year anniversary or the 250th anniversary of colonial rule. And to me, I just wonder what we're celebrating when we do that, right? So I think the African burying ground is one of those stories. There's so many stories. There's a story of Nancy Prince from Hancock, New Hampshire. She was enslaved in Massachusetts, got her freedom. She comes to New Hampshire. Both her and her husband ends up working for the Tsar in Russia, and then when her husband died and he's buried in Russia. When he dies, she goes to the Jamaica, and she was part of the rebellion there. And then we see her in other places in the Caribbean before she comes back here. And what is that? We look at our stories as these people are, sedentary. They're in their one place. They don't go anywhere. But here we have, formerly enslaved person traveling to Russia, mind-blowing. Once we start looking at those stories, we honor that story of the hero, right? And just being an enslaved person and surviving is the story of a hero. That there's still African Americans after the atrocities of enslavement is the American story.
Thank you. Can you talk about the new marker being dedicated next month for Amos Fortune in Jaffrey?
So who wrote that question?
I don't know.
I was going to say, must be somebody from Jaffrey. So yeah, we're unveiling, it's one of our 5 markers that we've unveiled this year. Amos Fortune was a formerly enslaved man who buys his own freedom, moves to Jaffrey. He was in the 60s when he moved to Jaffrey. He starts a tanning business in Jaffrey. He works and buys the freedom of not 1, but 2 wives. His first wife died. He wasn't a polygamist. He left a bequeath to the town for a lecture series that still continues today, the Amos Fortune Lyceum Forum. Thanks. I'm really terrible. I don't remember the date for the unveiling, but I think it's the 3rd week in August. I'll have to look it up and get that to you. We'll be unveiling a marker in his honor at his gravesite.
Okay. Being that there is no historical image of Harriet Wilson, what was the process of coming to an image of her for the Milford Monument?
So I laugh at this because we're giving them a hard time about Wentworth Cheswell. All right, so when we did the monument in Milford, the thinking was, Wilson's book was published in 1859, and in 2002, after I've been living in New Hampshire, there was no mention of Wilson in the town. Gates republished the book in 1983. All his scholars came to the town. The town knew about it because it was a big thing when it was republished in 1983. And again, in 2002, I knew nothing about Harriet Wilson, the first Black woman to publish a novel. In 2002, an article came out in Black History Month honoring Harriet Wilson. And I saw that an article, op-ed came out in response to that article, saying that a teacher from the high school said that it's not that they had forgotten about the book, it's just that it shouldn't be studied in the high school because it was written it was difficult to read. It was written in Old English. It spoke of sexual molestation, which if you ever read the book, it would be hard to find, especially when you're studying it at a high school level. And the third thing she said was that honoring it for the gem that it was, it's best studied at a college level. And so what I saw was that there was yet another effort to erase Wilson from the town. So I had formed a group of women and us, and our main goal was to raise awareness of Harriet Wilson in her hometown. And in looking at these deliberate effort to erase the story, we said we needed to make her presence in the town permanent and visible. So we wanted to, we came up with the idea of putting a statue in the town to honor her. Now, when we came up with that idea, we knew that there were no pictures of her, but we did a call for artists, and we asked them, we wanted a life-size monument to reflect. Our call for proposal said they had to read the book, it had to reflect her her composure, her stories. There were only two identifying markers in her book that talked about her hair and her skin. She had curly hair and, skin. But the artist that we ended up getting, Fern Cunningham, said that if we were going to, we didn't know that this is what we were doing, but if we were going to be the first statue to honor a person of color, then it had to look like a person of color, right? It couldn't have these features that were not a person of color. And so we knew that she was biracial. The artist took I had a student that had the spunk of Harriet Wilson from her book, and the statue is a representation of her student. But as you know, when an artist is doing a project, something takes over, and it just happened to be what it looks like, right? That composite of who we really truly believe is Harriet.
For those of us who don't know about the attempted recent lynching in Claremont, could you tell us more?
Is there anybody else who who knows that story, who wants to mention that? Yeah.
You could come here.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. So I hope I'm recalling it correctly. What I recall is that it was a very young boy of color who was very young, like 7, 8, 10,
Yeah,
9. So
9.
my nephew's age, and it was in the period of post-George Floyd, and sorry, I'm nervous because these are really harmful words, where some people were going with the viral videos of kneeling. And so what happened, what I recall from the news, was that there were a few little white boys that put a rope around the black boy's neck and tried to drag him off this picnic table to attempt to lynch him. And that it was under investigation. And the reason why I remember it is I was thinking about the power of social media at the time and the good that it can give us, but also the harm that it could continue to perpetuate. So that's the story in a synopsis. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the kids fled because they were afraid they would get in trouble when he started to struggle, so they ran. And from what I know of the story, had it not been for his sister, we would be having a different conversation right now. But I do have to say I appreciated the way the town responded to what occurred. There were a lot of community meetings, a lot of discussions, a lot of working in the schools. As a matter of fact, the film Shadows Fall North was shown at the high school with a lot of discussions around that and some work that they did as a result of this. So I have to say that the town really did respond to what had occurred, because everybody from the leaders to the kids were just shocked by this. Not sure what happened with the children who did this, but I do know the boy was really injured, because I saw him, saw his neck, and it was a very close call. So
Yeah, I think both Dottie and I were part of a bunch of the town meetings that they had to discuss coming together.
yes.
What was it, coming together?
So, oh gosh, we have so many more good questions, and our time is up. But were there any sundown? I just needed to ask that one. Sundown towns in New Hampshire. That's one of the questions. And the
So officially, that's under research, but we know like in Portsmouth, you know, if you were not belonging to somebody, you had to be out of the town before sundown. What we do have officially in New Hampshire is warning outs. If there was a person of color, Blanchard, the man I spoke about who was the veterinarian in Milford, he was warned out of Wilton, and he moved to Milford. And he was warned out of Milford, but he stayed as well. So warning out was an official letter from the town administrators asking a person of color to leave the town.
Well, thank you very much, JerriAnne, for sharing your time, but most of all, your knowledge about this amazing part of New Hampshire history. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Hey, Greg. Thank you. Thank you. I can see now. Hey, Pauline.
I would also like to offer an apology to the musician. And darn it, I put the card away with your name, Virginia Eskin. And it was Virginia, not that other thing that I said. So I do apologize, my deepest apologies, after such a wonderful kind of, display of music, and for me to make that mistake is a problem. So I apologize for that. So we hope you enjoyed today's live broadcast at the Monadnock Summer Lyceum. Thank you very much for supporting the 2023 season. Please join next week to hear Summer Lopez talking about why banning books is a threat to democracy, connected to today. So now join us for this informal reception in the parish hall, as I said, through the door to the right. Thank you very much for attending.